I'm going to begin our conversation. Well, I'm going to begin it by reading one of Liz's poems from Letters in a Bruised Cosmos, her second book. But before I do that, I just want to express how deeply honored I am to be invited to talk with you, Liz, and how wonderful it is for many reasons, but really because we've known each other for quite a long time, almost a decade, I think, and just to have the chance to go more deeply and into our mutual interests. And I'm fooling around here because I'm trying to get a bigger image of you on my screen because you're really small. It's not working. Oh, well. Yeah, I've been reading and reading and reading with some anxiety and also a lot of happiness and excitement to prepare for this. And so I'm going to read Settler Anishinaabe Noli Turbare. I'm going to repeat that. Settler Anishinaabe Noli Turbare. Beauty is my irreparable I, and today I become geometric. A faux linear figure that distills a skip trace of first principles. In a whiteout of Atlantic snow, banging stars into the ephemeral vein of Euclid while rows of lavender circuits, all porous, surrounded me. I genuflected before the hospital parking lot of my father's jaundice, for I am a good daughter of the colony which begot the immortal heart of the markets. Resources nursed all young bucks of the florets, a liquidity I should service or else receive a lesser dessert. With my smudge cleanse at the ready, I find myself dispensing with the usual future haunt of resilience, a survival signaling my relationship to time, or am I out of it entirely? Come polygon and I circumvent the disaster. Do not disturb my circles. Wholly I went, wholly all around my head. The holy I am went careening down the back stairs of this low-rise rental. Striated by the pinnacle light of this city that has my blood pooled purple at the center of its gravity. You can scan the ground from overhead for death pits. I read this on the internet when I was dehydrated, lonely, and afraid. Office plants become the broad-leafed repositories for my cognition's failed heart. I've gone and been abominable. A column extended from the top of my head into heaven. At the edges of my system, Anishinaabeg or Indo-European projection of words, my nerves, could translate into the crawl space of animal magnetism. White pine verticals send us up as a stomach pumped by filial love. Oh, inconsequent curb of my street, I refuse to kneel. This day, like any other. Plush pockets of rust about another falsehood of water, a creek that pleats. I've gone and got a blister. That summer, a black bear's muzzle got coated in shellac from the aerosol can she bit through on my mother's porch at the edge of the forest. 4 generations ago, my great-grandmother said, "Don't ever shoot a black bear. They are my people." Makwa, makwa, from the North Shore. Before I continue to speak more than this mortuary sunrise where I am only just alive, Uzu, Anin, hello, today is over.
Thank you, Lisa Miigwech. That was just absolutely thrilling. Such an incredible gift to hear my work in your voice. And of course, I'm deeply honored and grateful to be able to be in this conversation with you, who has been such an inspiration for me and a mentor. And in a sense, a writing life model. And I'm going to read an excerpt of your poem on form for Jane Ellison. You could say that form is learning. You can see form take shape at the coronal suture's first arcade. It's explaining, it's appearing, unestranged from enormity's prick of a spiny plant like a rose. Experimenting, it's bursting, and usually it's repeating. Why is form a dog, as a horse, as a deer, as a fish and a bramble, a greater rapacious? The second cervical vertebra is repeating, is a question we can ask with our bodies. And what is a tooth? Coccyx is the beak of an ancient dove below the sacrum. The tip of the sacrum places in the person a sensation of slow form repeating it. Doesn't require its own skin to repeat. Fox, a foxtail, a lizard, as so as. A small flask of modern oil at the throat. The repeat carries rising of thorax as guitar, the hairs exact and between bodies, forms not ever without a stupendous body, so the repetition is never exact. This is why form is always learning. As it moves across surfaces, as on the cleft above the lips, to be repetition is never exact. This is why form is learning or becoming, or how as it moves across timely surfaces, including the intricately folded surfaces sucked when kissing. Sometimes the lower lip has a crease like a waking girl in the real territory of the conceptual. The liver is a crown, it is a vessel, it constitutes our form, it constitutes our life. Form is folding. So I selected this excerpt of your poem because, for somewhat selfish reasons, it's one of my favorites. And also because it has an interesting backstory and one that I think illuminates some core aspects of your practice. So in the notes, it says, a main source of the poem's context came from translations of archaic Greek terms for the human body and its parts that you undertook while you were at a library. This poem is also dedicated to Vancouver dancer and choreographer Jane Ellison. So this poem illustrates for me your attunement to language as embodied, also the generative potential of relative indeterminacy. There's lots of space for the reader's own mind in your work to make connections and to think for them themselves. And also complexity that is nevertheless characterized by a sumptuousness and a cognitive sensuality. And it also illustrates, your practice of working with antiquated texts and the sort of research you do in your practices of deep reading, sometimes in archives and libraries, and also your engagement with the arts and how this poem itself is a sort of dance. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the poem's composition, and also briefly in reference to your essay Notes on Form and Belief, in which you have written that form is a bodily event and form is always historical. Could you please speak for us about how you invoke how you invoke embodiment and history through form?
Okay. I'll approach answering that little constellation, well, that big constellation of questions kind of in a meandering way. First of all, I'll say that the notes that that I used to compose the poem were made when I was working at the Warburg Library in London. And I had a month-long residency and research fellowship at Queen Mary University of London in order simply to work full-time at the Warburg. And this is a library that interests me a great deal because it's deeply invested in the relationship of the history of the image, like in art history. It was started by an art historian, Abby Warburg, who died just before the First World War, and who wrote his dissertation in the 1880s. Warburg was interested in the relationship of the image to a deep history of cosmology. And he formed his book collection in an extremely idiosyncratic way. First, I should say he was super wealthy, so he was able to do this, and he convinced his family to support his book buying escapades. And as he formed the library, he never made an index or a catalog for the library, but it came to be organized according to the four cardinal directions or the four humors. And with each of the directions or humors being filled out or populated by a group of books. So I went in there to research the history of geometry, the origins of geometry. And I was reading about Kepler, the Baroque geometer who discovered the elliptical paths of the planets. So I was on the floor that had the history of science. But the history of science also included magic and the history of medicine and ways of describing the human body and its relationship to geology, geography, consciousness. So I had this task, which was learning everything I possibly could about Kepler. But you can imagine there was really a lot of things to pull my attention away in lots of directions. So I gave myself the space to do side projects. And when you go there, it's open stacks, and you get to keep the same group of books. I mean, not take them home with you, but you get shelf space to put them on, and then you go back and you put them back on your desk again each day. And so almost as soon as I started working there, I found Frances Yates, the Renaissance historian's copy of the Anatomy of Melancholy. She had been a member of the Warburg Institute, and she willed her books to the library. So I kept Frances Yates's copy of Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy on my desk as a kind of touchstone for a month. And very close to the Anatomy of Melancholy on the shelf, I found this very peculiar book that was looked like it was done in the 1960s or 70s, and it was sort of a homemade book. it was mimeograph. It was like a mimeograph of a typescript, some sort of, manual typewriter typed thesis. And it had been published in Poitiers, which is very close to where I live. And it was done by a woman historian of language around the human body. So I kept that on my desk as well. So those two books were something that every morning I would go into before I started my work on Kepler. So basically, this book by I'm afraid I did not note her name anywhere where I could find it for today, unfortunately. I went into her book every morning, and it was written in French, and she was writing about the etymology of archaic Greek words for the parts of the human body. So archaic Greek is earlier than classical Greek. And I was very loosely translating. In many instances, I'm certain that what I was doing was wildly mistranslating. But what I was interested in was the texture of language that I was finding there. And I was interested in how these etymologies, which she was setting out, showed that the names for the parts of the body very often came from tools or craft processes or cooking procedures, all of the kinds of small actions that we perform domestically in order to survive and to care for one another. So the shoulder blades were cheese boards, and the fingers were little fishes, and the spine was the stem of a spiny rose, or it was a fish spine. It was many, many things. So as I was reading this book and trying to come to some understanding of it, I was feeling that I was becoming familiar with a whole environment. I was becoming familiar with aquatic life and plant life and ways of living on the earth and actions that people performed in and passed along to one another. The ribs were a little boat, but their ribs were also a loom for weaving. So I was enchanted by this. So every day I would just add to my very, very rough notes, and but then I continued with what I saw as my main task. Much later, once I'd returned home, I was invited by a Vancouver artist named Sydney Hermant, who is part of a collective. I've jotted this down because I don't want to. I've jotted it down, but can I find it? Great. Yes, here we go. Sydney Hermant. Okay, she's part of a collective in Vancouver called Project Rainbow. This is a media collective. Sydney is a visual artist, and she's deeply involved with artist-run centers. And she's a musician who's part of a great band called Hello Blue Roses. You can find Hello Blue Roses on the regular ways that we all find things. She's great. So Sydney wrote to me and asked me if I could write a text that she and the Project Rainbow Collective could use in a in a documentary video that they were making on the Vancouver dancer and choreographer Jane Ellison. Now, I know Jane. I took some movement lessons with Jane when I was in Vancouver doing a residency at SFU just over a decade ago, so just before the time when you and I met. And Jane, as well as being a dancer and choreographer, is one of the founding artists of the Western Front, one of the earliest artist runs in Vancouver. And she teaches movement classes there every week that are just fabulous. Like it's a cross between dance and breathing practice, and you're learning about your body, and you're moving with a big group of people in many different ways. So I'd had this great experience taking Jane's classes. And so I relished taking on this project. And it seemed to me that it was a good opportunity to go back into the notes that I had just recently made at the Vorburg Library and make a text about the body that moved with the freedom yet detailed precision that Jane encourages people to experience together in her movement classes. So that's kind of the story of that. But I thought there was something else I could tell you about it too, because as I was writing that piece, I was working on a different essay simultaneously, and not the one called Notes on Form and Belief, which I can't actually remember when I wrote that one now. But I write about form a lot because it's a problem that really interests me. I mean, I'm attracted to formal questions. Form is a huge interest to me in poetry. And it's the basic question of how to be in a body too, how to inhabit a form that continues recognizably in time as it's changing. So I was writing an essay for another Vancouver artist named Liz Magor, who's a sculptor. And she works with garments a lot in her work, like secondhand clothes that she finds when she's thrift shopping. And so I wrote a piece for Liz that's called Garments Etruscans. And the reason Etruscans comes into it is because I learned that the etymology of the word form, which comes from Latin, originates in the Etruscan language. The Romans took a lot of vocabulary from the Etruscans. The Etruscan language is not part of Indo-European. It's one of the odd languages in the region we call Europe, which seems to have no precedence, and which also, kind of like the Basque language, seems to have not developed into anything. It's just like a language that occurred. But the Etruscans did borrow from other cultures. And so they borrowed from Greek the term morphe, M-O-R-P-H, like as in morphology, and it means change, of course, to morph. But they flipped it. They flipped it backwards. So they changed morph into form. And I read somewhere the theory that Etruscan was a ceremonial language constructed on inversions. So I was really interested in this notion of
speaking backwards.
Yeah. And maybe this was for some ceremonial reason. Right. And of course, I connected that to garments, which also can be easily inverted. Yes. But I got this just super short little bit from Garments Etruscans. One meaning of form is the resting place of a hair meaning like the rabbit-like animal, not rabbit. Surely a hare doesn't stop for long. Form only pauses. So
that's incredible. Thank you for mirroring sort of in parallel or expanding upon the constellation of ideas and questions that I'd had for you. Did you want? Should we continue on from there?
Yeah,
I wanted to also ask you about, and perhaps like this might in a way lead into it, about your new work, Boat, which is an indexical reading of your own archive. And you've sort of generated poetry based on your own previous journals and thinking books. And you've done this process 3 times. The first resulted in a chapbook called Rousseau's Boat. And then a second time, a publication, which I believe mostly came out in the States, called Ours Boat. And now you've performed this indexical process a third time. Boat. And Boat sort of combines all 3 texts, inclusive of, I think, Rousseau's Boat, which is interior to Ours Boat, which is now interior to Boat itself, and is a book ended by a new poem called The Hut, and also the tiny notebooks of Night. And I just thought it would be interesting for especially the students to hear about that process of sort of like of self-reference and always being in sort of in conversation with yourself.
Sure. Well, most of my work is somewhat archival in origin, similar to the process I described in writing on form at the Vorburg Library. I'm going somewhere and learning new things about the history of something. And in doing so, I'm borrowing a lot of language and finding ways to rearrange that language, to restructure it, to resequence it in order to, and also to interrupt it in order to make something new. So that's how I wrote my book, The Weather, for example, working in an archive, in a meteorological archive at Cambridge University Library. When I started writing, making the work that became Rousseau's Boat, I was treating the whole mass of all of my life of writer's notebooks as that kind of archive. So I was going back to old material that I felt quite distant from. And these notebooks would have everything in them from descriptions of dreams, grocery lists, just to, I'm going to sort of show you, just to reading notes, it's just everything. And, typically they're this kind of thing, this kind of notebook. So I tend to use them and then just stack them up. And occasionally if I'm teaching or need to write an essay, I try to find material out of them, but I never had systematically done anything with them until I decided to make a piece using some of the methods I invented for myself in, say, writing about the weather and meteorology, or architecture and urban space, but using my own notebooks instead of the sort of posh archive of elsewhere, but approaching these as if trying to approach them as if from a great distance. So I'm not really identifying, and I'm not looking for an autobiographical thread particularly. So each poem that I've written for this project called Boat, and it now looks like this. These copies, they got wet. the house flooded.
Very sort of apropos.
Yeah, I've got these kind of loaded, crispy books, which are kind of funny. So I don't know. I think there's like 8 poems in here now. Each poem, to write each poem, I read all of the notebooks. So now there's a lot of them. It's like, notebooks going back to the mid 80s, really. But when I'm reading them, I'm looking for a certain kind of language, and I'm systematically culling it and just making big lists. So I'm doing this is what I'm kind of calling indexical. I'm sort of skimming, looking for sometimes for a keyword, sometimes for a type of description of space, for example. And I stick to that one keyword or that one typology for the whole reading of all of them. Then I've got a mass of material that represents a skimming of one full reading. Then I start working with it and figuring out what to do with it, how to form it. So I guess I've done that. I guess I could count and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 9, 9 poems. So I've done that 9 times now in sort of, 3 tiers. And when I started, I was just writing one poem. And it was also a sort of invited text for a special issue of a journal based on Lynn Haginian's work. So it was kind of a way to respond to her beautiful, it was a way to respond to my life, to kind of find a way to write my life that honored her process. I mean, that book, her book, My Life, just kind of cracked open my entire relationship to writing when I first read it in, I don't know, 87, maybe, something like that. Then took a workshop with her at Kootenai School of Writing, maybe in 88. And so a lot of things changed for me around that time. And anyway, so writing these poems in Boat began with trying to discover a way to write a response text to my life that would, parallel the process. So it was kind of like a non-narrative or non-self-referential autobiographical text. So each time I've done it, I've re-entered the massive notebooks differently, so I end up with a completely different kind of poem. And now that, as it turns out, I've done this several times, it actually, what started out as a single text has become a kind of life poem. It turns out that I've written a long poem over 20 odd years, which I find kind of both, I find kind of amusing, really. I never really set out to write, our modernist predecessors, Pound, Olson, Zhukovsky, H.D., who wrote big, long poems over their whole lives. I never had an interest in doing that, but I kind of inadvertently did it by accretion, nevertheless. So I have this book now that is an autobiographical long poem that uses my notebooks as a kind of distanced archive. So that's the story of the Boat. But I would really like to switch our conversation away from my work and into your work. Now, there's so many ways into this work. It's so beautiful. It's syllabically so intricately knitted.
Yes.
There's both a an intricate continuity of line at the same time as there's a crystalline attention to the to syllabics and sound. And each time I read it, I am more and more blown away by it. The questions I have to kind of try to lead you into talking about it just seems so slight in relationship to what you're doing. But I'll begin by asking you a question about geometry. The title of this poem, Settler, Anishinaabe Noli Turberi, references Archimedes. Mm-hmm. And then in the first two lines, you make a statement very specific about geometry. Beauty is my irreparable eye, and today I became geometric. Can you start by talking about geometry, the representation of the earth, measure of the earth in relationship to the poem?
Yes. Yeah.
What is earth? What is land?
Land. Like to start by talking a little bit about that about the title. So Settler and Anishinaabe are sort of refers to who I am, my identity, that I'm a settler and Anishinaabe origin, and and the suffix que denotes woman, and then Noli Turbare is part of a longer Latin phrase, Noli Turbare circelos meos, which loosely translates to "do not disturb my circles," which apparently was exclaimed by Archimedes before he was murdered by Roman soldiers. The story is probably apocryphal, like a lot of I've read. Many of the stories attributed to his life are. But at the time, the Roman soldiers came for him, he was doing some geometrical work in the sand. And there was something about desiring the preservation of one's work and the importance of one's work, even above one's life, as something that I connected with, maybe as a poet, you may destroy me, and my inevitable fate may be in destruction, but preserve my work, don't touch my work. And then also in the opening of the poem, I talk about becoming geometric, and a skip trace of first principles. And a lot of this it's sort of done with a bit of a heavy sort of both an irony and a longing for this, this desire for certainty, for simplicity, for something like an axiom, like one of Euclid's fundamental sort of originating principles of geometry is between any 2 points you can draw a straight line. So it's a kind of desire for absolute, for these lucid absolutes, a simple truth to hold on to. But sort of in reality, in this poem, the voice or the subject of this poem really couldn't feel any farther any further from these mathematical forefathers and the places where their work is taken up. And so I actually sort of in a sense, I reimagine Euclid as an IV drug user. So there are stars being banged into the femoral vein of Euclid. And to bang something can be slang to inject something intravenously, and also banging also has the connotation of a collision or hitting, and there's also a sort of sexual connotation. So I was pulling through all of that. Also, there's this idea of a skip trace, right? Which is looking for someone who doesn't want to be found or is different. And this idea of like first principle is kind of an ironical invocation of this idea that the father is sort of like the model of a girl's sort of like desires, or, you know, they will be attracted to someone who is like their father. So for me to sort of like be running a skip trace on like the first principle of love, which is the father, you know, is to go searching for someone, you know, who abandoned me. And then like, what does this portend for love in my life? Since I'm basically sort of running skip trace on someone who wasn't and is a ghost. And then in terms of land, I think of land as the material language of time. And I'm interested in how poetry can, you know, radically collapse time in the present. I have a line in another poem which says, history is a sewing motion along the thin membrane. So it's able to sort of stitch the past within the present with this idea of futurity, right? Of determining what might come next, or future thoughts will follow. And also land being, you know, for me, the first principle of consciousness, and feeling, you know, my consciousness and my coming to consciousness was directly formed by and on the land of Northern Ontario, where I was raised. And I was nourished by that landscape, both intellectually and physically. It was there that I spent hours, you know, in the bush, studying plants and animals and the texture of language itself, the relative heights and the destiny of the density of trees, where streams originated and traveled to, what was edible. I'd often, you know, mimic the calls of birds and sort of like try to speak their language. And I spent hours reflecting and writing in the bush, often beside a lake, somewhere where I felt was a locus of power. And I would have this experience of a sense of presence, you know, in the woods, something like a dark and divine intelligence of the forest, also ancestors, and of past animals who may have once moved through that landscape.
I'm going to read a paragraph from a letter that you sent me 2 days ago now. That's incredibly beautiful. And I should say to everybody who's listening to this conversation that I asked Liz if it was okay if I read this aloud, because I consider it to be a personal document. But I think you will see why I want to read this. Liz wrote to me, growing up, I had a basement room in a house beside the local cemetery. I once dreamed that I screamed so loud that I woke up the dead who walked out of their graves to air their complaints at me. I came to realize that I was sleeping, dreaming, writing in a notebook at the same level as the dead were buried, not far away. I came to see my writing as something I did with the dead that came from an ancestral realm, though I do try to be humble about the knowledge I received in that basement. So there's so much to say about that paragraph, and in relationship to your statement about the land being the first principle of consciousness. And I think that in this story about your childhood, about realizing that your basement room was like on a level with the graves nearby, the fact of them being graves in the dead could somehow overpower a more basic thing, which is that the earth, the ground, the dirt, the humus, etc., it becomes a medium for knowledge. That the knowledge that you're receiving from the dead is coming to you through this shared medium of the earth. So I just want to invite you to talk more about earth and the dead in relationship to language.
Yeah, so of course, growing up in this basement was very formative for me, and coming to this realization that I was dreaming, sleeping and dreaming and writing at the same level as the dead, allowed me to access a part, like, I don't know if it's my own consciousness, or as I say, like a sort of like ancestral realm through which, language could come. I've often talked about this in using the metaphor of the shaking tent ceremony, which is a ceremony for receiving information from beyond the human world. In the ceremony, a special tent is constructed that has a hole at the opening, and a Jasakin a conjurer, enters the tent, and it begins to shake with the force of prophecy of all of these spirits coming to inform the conjurer about any number of questions that the community may have posed to the conjurer inside the tent. And the spiritual knowledge, which comes through all these various sort of animal affiliated spirits, vastly distributed in space and time, is then conveyed to a central spirit, Mikanak, the turtle, who is the translator, who is the only spiritual being who is able to also speak in Anishinaabe, and then convey this information to the community. When I read about this rite, I've not had the privilege to be able to experience it myself, having grown up outside of culture, and am now gradually reconnecting to it. Reading about it through various sources, I found a deep sense of familiarity with it, as it's akin to what I experience when I'm writing. That the writing comes from almost like sort of an embodied and intuitive, and an often nonverbal space. And what I need to do is perform a kind of translation procedure on this material that's arising in me, or being transmitted through me. And then I would write, and I usually write in a kind of automatic writing style or a stream of consciousness. And I'll fill notebooks in this way.
I'm going to refer now to your reading of Catherine Malibu.
Okay.
not to change tracks though, but you start Letters in a Bruised Cosmos with an epigraph by Catherine Malibu. A new being comes into the world for a second time out of a deep cut that opens in a biography. And this is from Malibu's essay, Ontology of the Accident, an essay on destructive plasticity. And I just read this. First of all, thanks for finally making me, for making the context for me to read this book, which I've been meaning to read for ages. So I just read Ontology of the Accident this morning, and I came to a realization about the writing process very similar to what you just said about your association of the experience of the shaking tent with the writing process as a sort of being thrown out of time in a certain way into an outside state. And this is something that Catherine Malibu talks about in her notion of ontology, mostly in terms of pathology and trauma. And I don't want to trivialize the force that trauma can have in shaping our consciousness and in ways that could be either or both pathological and more creatively transformational. But she doesn't go all that far into exploring this sort of this plasticity as being something more than destructive. But you're talking about plasticity as being generative. So I just want to invite you to talk to us about your reading of Malibu and what you think about this plasticity that she's talking about in relationship to a shaking tent like writing consciousness.
Yeah, so the epigraph that I start my book off with is a new being comes into the world for a second time out of a deep cut that opens in a biography. So it's this sense that through a process of destructive plasticity, due to, trauma, be that physical or, violently psychological in nature, there's a sort of a creation or eruption of a completely new person that gradually takes up the space that was formerly occupied by the previous person. So in a sense, the individual becomes almost a stranger to themselves or irreconcilable to themselves and unrecognizable to themselves. And I've personally, found myself in this state. And this is why, Malibu's text was very attractive for me to provide me with some sort of like theoretical scaffolding for what I was trying to grapple with and to grapple with in writing itself, right? And all of that being sort of like deeply vulnerable. But also I've always found writing to be, an experimental process, an exploratory process, and a generative process. And I feel that what I am trying to accomplish is a kind of radical transformation, or something that I've come to call like a sublimation. So sublimation, not referring to like the Freudian sense, like turning a dark impulse into a socially acceptable one, but something closer to like a physical change, like sublimation, like turning something directly from a solid into a gas, or even like the more archaic meaning of the term, which is, to make almost divine, to render sublime, but sublimating, this this fissile and sort of like generatively destructive material into something which is more than itself, and more than just a reinstating of the trauma, or a reflection of the trauma. It creates something entirely new, and perhaps more generative way, and in a way that also creates a kind of space, or like something that you, for example, like referred to as a capaciousness or a commodiousness, right? To create something that is somehow, radically open. But also for me, something that is fundamentally tied to embodiment. And I think that's where, the sort of the syllabic luxuriousness or sort of rigor comes into play for me. And sort of reading back, through some of my own notes. And I think that I was very influenced by, as I believe perhaps you were as well, by Olson's, projective verse in Composition by Field, and where he writes, from the head by way of the ear to the syllable, from the heart by way of the breath to the line. And that's something that I sort of take to my books, as it were, and I'm trying to work with that sort of hospitable and transformational transmission of energy.
Yeah.
From this sort of site of strife, resistance, ancestral voices that come through the land, and that come through my embodiment and its various, perhaps fraught experiences, and to create something which, at least for me, like creates the experience of standing outside of time. Something that extends the cosmos.
Yeah, completely. I just a couple of weeks ago listened to a fabulous conversation with Dion Brand, between Dion Brand and David Nyman, on it's like tin fish. I forget what the site is called. Do you know this guy, David Nyman? He interviews people, and it's his recent interview with Dion was probably 2 hours long. He's also recently interviewed Hélène Sixou.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So towards the end of the Dion Brand interview, which I listened to as I was making fig chutney, chopping figs, Dion says, narrative is a practice of time. Time is a practice. A writer has to undo time, undo what has come to be called time. And this chimes so closely to me with the Catherine Malibu deep cut that opens in a biography, how this traumatic experience of the cut can open the space for a revisioned organization of the experience of time. And I think it's the narrative convention, of course, and even the Catherine Malibu phrase talking about a cut in time looks at time as a continuity or a linearity. But what I see happening in your work is like time is land. Time is body, time is land, and it's something that is unstable, nonlinear. And I just have this fabulous list of verbs I want to read you that I got from Leibniz's book, Protogaea, which is about the formation of the earth. And I transcribed these verbs from the English translation of Leibniz because it seemed to me that everything that he was saying about the earth and its transformations, each of these verbs could equally apply to an opened and thick description and experience of time. So freezing, thrusting, flooding, buttressing, swelling, bulging, submerging, protruding, bursting, rupturing, fusing, sinking, collapsing, smashing, striating, washing, abiding, gliding, and weaving. There's probably loads more, but somehow that was my notebook scrawling from reading Leibniz. And I'd like to use that juicy list as a way to kind of swerve or segue into a conversation now about Thomas Browne, the 17th century English writer who we share a passionate interest in, and after whom your cat is named.
Yes.
Yes. So Thomas Browne wrote several texts, but for the purposes of our discussion currently, wrote a text called Hydriotaphia. Hydriotaphia, how would you say it? Like that?
I say hydriotaphia, but I have no clue on what the quote-unquote proper.
Me neither. But what it means is urn burial. So do you want to just describe this text a little bit, and then maybe I'll read a passage from it out loud?
Yes, it was a really influential treatise on local archaeology, cultural burial practices, and also the human struggle against mortality. And Sir Thomas Browne himself, he was a medical doctor and also a writer, and he's known for his incredibly lush, hypotactic, sort of very long, descriptive sentences. And basically, he also puts what seems like the entire contents of his library, or the state of anybody's library at the time, in a citational way, referencing different aspects of the death process and mortality and burial customs across different cultures and according to different historical authorities and sources.
Yeah. I found out when I was doing a little bit of background reading on him the other day that Juna Barnes also cites him in Nightwood. Yes. So that Dr. Matthew, the trans gynecologist who gives these wonderful monologues about the night, some of his sentences come straight out of Hydriotaphia, and also some of them come from the other fabulous essay that we might not. I'm not sure how much we'll get to talk about it, but the Garden of Cyrus, which is kind of the companion piece to urn burial, where urn burial is about death rituals and death customs. The Garden of Cyrus is about generative pattern in the world. So when I was rereading urn burial, it seemed he's often describing the objects found with human remnants, what gets buried with a dead person. And in a certain way, it's an essay about grave goods. And I began to think of language itself as being a kind of grave goods. So I'm going to read this passage so that we can revel in his juicy prose, but also sort of hear about the contents of some graves. Whether they were the bones of men or women or children, no authentic decision from ancient custom in distinct places of burial. Although not improbably conjectured that the double sepulture or burying place of Abraham had in it such intention. But from exility of bones, thinness of skulls, smallness of teeth, ribs, and thigh bones, not improbable that many thereof were persons of minor age or women. Confirmable also from things contained in them. In most were found substances resembling combs, plates like boxes, fastened with iron pins, and handsomely overwrought like the necks or bridges of musical instruments, long brass plates overwrought like the handles of neat implements, brazen nippers to pull away hair, and in one a kind of opal, yet maintaining a bluish color. Now that they accustomed to burn or bury with them things wherein they excelled, delighted, or which were dear unto them, either as farewells unto all pleasure, or vain apprehension that they might use them in another world, is testified by all antiquity. Observable from the gem or beryl ring upon the finger of Cynthia, the mistress of Propertius, when after her funeral pyre her ghost appeared unto him, and notably illustrated from the contents of that Roman urn preserved by Cardinal Farnese, wherein, beside great number of gems with heads of gods and goddesses, were found an ape of agate, a grasshopper, an elephant of amber, a crystal ball, 3 glasses, 2 spoons, and 6 nuts of crystal. And beyond the content of the urns, in the monument of Childeric I and 4th king from Pharamond, casually discovered 3 years past at Tournai, restoring unto the world much gold, richly adorning his sword, 200 rubies, many hundred imperial coins, 300 golden bees, the bones of shoe of his horse interred with him, according to the barbarous magnificence of those days. So, as you well know, the whole essay is as gorgeously but also difficultly lush.
Would you say that it is Baroque?
Yeah, I would say absolutely that
very
it's
ornate.
Yeah, a different sense of what this sentence performs. It's not a complete action. It's more like a very elastic, pliable, earth-like container.
Yes.
which bulges with everything that you can possibly
grave
put
goods of
into it.
language.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. And I know you've been talking to me about reading Sebald's The Rings of Saturn.
Yes.
And Sebald's also a great reader of Thomas Brown. So is Sebald's book a kind of bibliographic grave goods too?
Yeah, I'll talk very briefly about it. So I'm drawn to Sebald in this book, in particular, The Rings of Saturn. You know, for his style, very much influenced by Brown. He has these dreamlike, hypotactic sentences, and this is a work that blurs the genres of travelogue, memoir, history, and fiction. In its essence, it's the account of a walking tour of the county of Suffolk in England, where he's engaging with the traces of, you know, ongoing human destruction, places and figures in the landscape that spur long associative digressions on world history and literature, and these are all tinged with melancholy. He writes at length about Sir Thomas Browne and Hydriotaphia, and I began a close reading of this text in the context of this summer returning to Northern Ontario for a research trip concerning the traces of ongoing colonization and that is evident in the landscape and in certain figures present and past within that landscape and town, and its impact, you know, on my community, my family, and by extension, myself. I was going to read 3 short excerpts. I think maybe that I shouldn't, though, because I think that we are running short on time.
We are a little. Maybe you could read one, though. That would be great.
Okay. To sort of tie it all together, I'll read the part where he's actually discussing Brown's Garden of Cyrus. He writes,
great.
As I sat there that evening in Southwold, overlooking the German Ocean, I sensed quite clearly the earth's slow turning into the dark. The huntsmen are up in America, writes Thomas Browne in the Garden of Cyrus, and they are already past their first sleep in Persia. The shadow of night is drawn like a black veil across the earth. And since almost all creatures, from one meridian to the next, lie down after the sun has set, so, he continues, one might, in following the setting sun, see on our globe nothing but prone bodies, row upon row, as if leveled by the scythe of Saturn, an endless graveyard for a humanity struck by falling sickness. And that is Sebald.
He's writing, of course, in the shadow of the Second World War.
Yes.
It's interesting how he's choosing a writer such as Brown, but also a later writer such as Chateaubriand to provide the descriptions, the language that can kind of index the political trauma of the present. And yeah, so what's your feeling about turning now at this point in history to Baroque vocabularies such as the vocabulary of melancholy, or not necessarily Baroque, ancient cosmological concepts like melancholy?
I think it's because it allows for, you know, as you've written, for this sort of like expansive interiority, this sort of utopian interiority of melancholic space as one of reflection and also like an interest in these kind of Baroque forms, also like for their capaciousness, for their sort of flexibility, and their associative nature, and potential, of being able to, through sentences, elucidate these different threads that are connecting historical events to like present happenings. So, for example, in the research that I was doing, just very, very briefly in Northern Ontario, when I was doing this sort of like embodied research of going back to the land that I grew up on and research, I went to a place in the forest that is rather open, and the ground is completely covered with caribou lichen. So it looks very white. And when I was young, I used to go there and sort of meditate, and also think back to a time like not so long ago when in fact caribou did live in the region, like the time before some of the more disruptive aspects of industrial development and settlement of the area. And within that, I connected it in my mind to some of this other research that I'm doing around pictographs within the general region. And there's this rock which contains a number of pictographs of some antiquity. They can't be accurately dated, but they're on the order of hundreds, perhaps even 500 years old. And in one of these pictographs, there is a representation of a caribou. So in fact, there's a kind of record of this human connection between the caribou in this land, and the representation of it, and its spiritual connotations and cultural importance on this rock. This rock is situated on land that was originally indigenous land. It was Oji-Cree land that was subsequently dispossessed from the Ojibwe and Cree, the Anishinaabe and Swampy Cree people during the formation of the Chapleau Crown Game Preserve, which is one of the largest crown game preserves in the world. But of course, this meant that they had to relocate, and they had no access to their traditional hunting and living and learning territories. So they were completely dispossessed of that life-sustaining and consciousness creating and extending place, right? And they were relocated to a reservation, who many of the individuals ended up being taken to a residential school, which was in the town, located in my hometown. And when I was 16, an elder from this reservation, where the people who were the original occupants of the land, of the rock with the caribou pictograph, he came and approached me and essentially sort of like blessed me and called upon like Gitchumanitou, the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery, to help me and heal me and to help me to quote unquote get out of this town. And this was a man who I learned afterwards had been through the residential school system in Chapleau. And so there are these sort of like loose associative strands and threads. And I think that there's something that Sebald is doing and also Brown is doing that is so sort of like open and dreamlike and malleable plastic in a way.
Yeah, I was thinking of Malbu's term of notion of destructive plasticity.
Yeah, so that's what drew me to the text. Exactly how this is all going to shake out in terms of form. I was hoping to go for prose. It'll probably be more like poetic prose.
So this is your current project.
Yes, it's part of,
Great.
It's one wing. It's one wing of this current project.
Yeah.
There are several.
I feel terrible interrupting this. I'm loving this conversation, but I think we need to, in the sense of time, I think we need to open up the Q&A if that's all right. Funny. I think I was telling you, Liz, that I was also working on Sir Thomas Browne because I worked in just down the hall from Sebald's office when I was working at East Anglia. And this is a very strange story, but I met a local historian in Norwich who sometimes dresses up like Sir Thomas Browne and reads out loud his texts. And so what I was trying to do was so they made a lot of maquettes of Sir Thomas Browne's skull, which Sebald tries to find. And I also tried to find where all the maquettes were, because apparently they were made because of phrenology, because phrenology was really popular at the time. So everyone wanted to measure Sir Thomas Browne's brain because they assumed it would be very, very large. It's super interesting. But one of the things I didn't know that the historian sent me this was the amount of words that Sir Thomas Browne invented. It is fascinating. I'll just read some so that people can hear. Ambidextrous, analogous, approximate, carnivorous, coexistence, coma, cryptography.
Indigenous is one of them.
Computer. It goes on and on. Gymnastic, hallucination. I mean, it's just incredible. I really am trying to, and then once I, started reading so much Sir Thomas Browne, I've been trying to encourage everybody to read Sir Thomas Browne because it is Baroque, but the language is so delicious and incredible. Read Sir Thomas Browne, everybody.
I totally agree with you. And I also feel that the content of what he's saying is interestingly relevant to many of our sort of post-structuralist discourses around the description of, I'm thinking of Deleuze, for example. These kind of rhizomatic theories of the world of being, they're incipient in Browne's work. Like if you read the Garden of Cirrus, it's all about this 5-point interlocking figure. You have a square with 4 points, a 5th point in the middle of it. So you have a square with a crisscross. He sees this form, which he calls the quincux. Yeah, as being the basic form of the constitution of life on animal life, plant life, and intellectual life on the
Earth. Formation of crystals as well.
Yes, yeah.
Which must be interesting for you in your writing on crystals.
Absolutely, but it's also the basic motif of weaving, the weave. So. So for Browne, sort of switching from his urn burial on death and mortuary practice to the Garden of Cirrus, Browne is describing a cosmology of a kind of an infinitely extendable horizontal patterning. That is very amenable to a lot of very contemporary descriptions of epistemology and ontology. But I found it just incredibly joyous to read The Garden of Cirrus, which I did last night before I fell asleep. I'd only read Urn Burial. And I realized I really did Browne a disservice by sticking with the melancholic and not going towards this exuberant, generative, celebratory mode that is in the accompanying essay. So I used to read him for style, but I'm saying you can read him for substance, and it's as excellent.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it, that everybody reads Urn Burial first. It's the sort of trademark, maybe because we read Sebald and, he references Urn Burial too, but it seems like some of the other texts are just equally as interesting. They had them sort of at one point on display during the Sebald exhibit at the museum. And I thought, oh, I have to read this. The one that I was reading was about getting rid of like new medical hoaxes that he was trying to decide whether they were hoaxes or not. And there was a text I'd never seen before. But it was fascinating to see him think through what was real and what was not real and get some of it very wrong, but in a super interesting way. It
was pseudodoxia epidemica.
Yes. Yeah. And that's an interesting text. I'd never read it before, but it was fascinating.
That's where he invents the word indigenous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so we have to close soon, but I'm just wondering if anyone has a question that they would really love to ask. Oh, I've got someone in the Q&A already. Okay. More of a comment. I listen to and find great comfort in non-dualistic writing and philosophy, but I find this form as purportedly opposite of Baroque in intricacy and also comforting and enlightening. I miss the recognition of this artistry and particularism as the strange and ironic, and I think essential and unfairly discounted partner to non-dualism. It's interesting.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I sort of have a question that I want to ask that a student asked that they really had a question about. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it. So I guess it's sort of about using the archive as like part of your work. And we were reading about Claudia Rankine and like the kind of archival poetics that she does. And this idea of like just attesting to various models of documentation, but then also thinking about the limits of their representational strategies. And so I'm wondering, Lisa, if like, I know you're only a few poems in, but what have you learned about the representational limits of your own archive? I think it's amazing and fascinating that you're using your own archive. I'm curious about what you've discovered about maybe the language or the form of your own archive.
It's still really difficult for me to assess this. I mean, I'm not trying to produce a description of my archive per se. I mean, one sort of obvious thing is when time passes, the content of an archive changes meaning. And what you think is most relevant or pertinent, at one point, is not necessarily what remains relevant and pertinent. But that's a pretty banal. I mean, I'm probably finished doing this project. I'm not really interested in talking about my own archive, actually. I mean, I've made this work out of it. The archive that my current work relates to much specifically is the archive of troubadour poetry and poetics, which relates to this land and this linguistic site where I live, which is the northernmost boundary of the old Aquitaine region, and it's the place where William IX of Aquitaine was from, the first troubadour. So a lot of my work that's sort of research-based and archivally based has to do with sites where I'm living. I did a book where I worked with the archives of the city of Vancouver. And it's called it's the Office for Soft Architecture book, and it started just by being very, very curious about new sites I was learning about in the city when I first got a dog, and I was walking a dog in different parts of the city than I was used to seeing. So a great deal of my work is really site specific, and it's a way it's a way to become familiar with unofficial histories, or it's a way to go more deeply into a site. And in that sense, I feel like there are no limits to an archival way of working. That there's always going to be objects, texts, language, styles of materiality that are hidden, that are not on the surface, or which are sometimes hidden on the surface, which is a good place to hide things, as Poe tells us, which are going to completely change your relationship to a place and your relationship to other people in that place. So my own sense is that the archive of site is limitless and always ready to transform you.
I love that. I mean, I think that the archival poetics that we were thinking about was more about like the representational strategy, like the limit of new media as kind of a bastion for information. But so I think it's also different when you are thinking about your own archive, that it could be limitless. I think that's interesting and really helpful for students who are trying to work with archival material. Penn Kemp says, I love this expansive conversation upon your archives and that moving paragraph from the letter that Liz wrote. What remains pertinent of one's archives, and how does one choose from long histories? Similar to what we're talking about. What remains pertinent of one's archives, and how does one choose from long histories? I think either of you could respond, actually.
Okay, so I sort of feel like that's already been addressed.
Yeah. Yep. I guess another question from a student that
I can just say something really quick about that.
Yeah.
One thing that's been interesting for me in an approach to an archive is, rather than going in looking for specific predetermined thematics, a kind of thematic line that you can follow, to use highly constraint-based programs for entering an archive can bring up amazing content that the need to construct linear narratives can leave behind. So constraint-based approaches to archival research will generate wild knowledge.
That's a great.
In which case, an archive is never finished, because you can always go in with a new constraint.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's very helpful, I think. Okay, we'll do one more. I wonder, Nikki, hi, Nikki. So Nikki's just adding something for the audience's info that David Nine Between the Covers is a great podcast. Great interviews with people like Carmen Maria Machado and Billy Ray Balcour. It's true. Really great, interesting interviews. Emma, I wonder this very generally, but I appreciate the opinion of other writers. Do you have advice for young beginner writers that may have trouble sharing their work or feeling pride in their work due to a lack of confidence? Have either of you ever felt this way about your writing, either early in your lives or in your careers? How did you handle it, and how did you grow to be comfortable with sharing your own work with the public?
This is totally normal, and don't worry about it. Find a close friend who you trust. The way to start to share your work is through actual intimate friendship. Where, share your work with the people you feel closest that you feel intellectually and creatively closest to. What do you think, Liz?
I think that's helpful as well. I think it's important, to try and, yeah, and build community. I ended up, taking, poetry classes and workshops with the same sort of people, and forming, writing groups and reading groups with other people, sharing work, with other writers to get their opinion, and going to a lot of readings around the city. I'm not sure how much that that happens anymore, or how much it's possible, sort of like given the pandemic. But in some reading series, there's an opportunity to read on the open mic. And that's how I first started to, gradually share my work, very, very nervously, but it's usually a pretty supportive environment. And a big thing that continues to help me is to record myself reading any piece of work and listening back to it over and over again, to help me get a sense for my own voice, to get a sense for the performance of a piece, if the piece is going to be shared that way, and to get a sense for pacing and rhythm, and that sort of like syllabic richness that at least I go for. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, and it's sort of repeating myself, but this feeling of insecurity about one's work, it's not a stage that you leave behind you. It keeps recurring. Every time I do new work, I freak out and think that it's total crap. And, maybe at some early stages, it actually is not really very good, and that's okay too. But when you have this feeling, it doesn't matter. You keep going anyways. The important thing is, okay, you can feel that, but it doesn't mean it's true. You can feel it very deeply, and it can almost paralyze you, as it can. But it's not a truth. So you keep working in spite of, or even in the space of, that insecurity. And I also think that giving that insecurity space in your work can deepen and enrich the work. A sort of overblown, premature, egocentric, unhesitating self-regard is rarely of interest in writing. Those are not the writers we really actually want to read. We want to read the writers who, are the writers who are drifting, who are bulging, who are buttressing. And Leibniz's great verbs for the actions of the earth, all kinds of things happen in this process. And they all have to be welcomed, and you go past them all too. On to the next bulge.
I think that might be a great place to end. To both of you, this has been just a spectacular conversation. It's just, I always find it so enriching and fabulous to hear writers just having a conversation and talking expansively, both about your own work and craft, and asking each other questions. So thank you so much for your generosity and your time. I think that everybody will have probably other questions that you might get some emails with questions later on. But for now, thank you both again for being here today, and the University of Winnipeg thanks you. Thanks to everybody else for joining us. And just know that there is another writer in residence coming up next semester. It will be Zoe Whittall, but I think this is probably a great time to just mention that next year's writer in residence is the wonderful Hiromi Gato. And I think there will be another great event. And they're talking about doing an event with a Japanese translator as the secondary guest, which I think will also be fabulous. So thank you very much. And thank you to you both, and have a lovely afternoon/evening.